Ah, yes, the beauty and majesty that is the smear frame. Ever pause a movie at the exact right time and have your eyeballs treated with something like this? Or this? Or, ooh, this is a good one. These are what's known as smear frames, for those of you who are not animation savvy, and it's a technique that's been around in the industry for a long time. To an outsider, these frames look bizarre and hilarious, but there's actually some important artistic and stylistic reasons we have smear frames. And no, it's not a sign of laziness. In fact, smear frames can be quite difficult to pull off well, and just like a movie has art direction it has to adhere to, smear frames also need to work within the art direction's own set of rules in an animation for it to look natural. This is why some smear frames can look like this, while others look like this. An animator has to be aware of these things to make sure that even one silly frame flows with the rest of his work. So let's break down smear frames and what they actually do. Animation is the rapid succession of drawings to convey movement. This rapid succession is called FPS, or frames per second, and that's exactly what it sounds like. The frames, or drawings, in each second of animation. Animations have a wide variety of frames per second you can work at, but the most common industry standards are 6, 8, 12, 24, and 30 frames per second. The smaller the number, the less smooth the animation is going to be. Now this all works because our eyes do something called persistence of vision. Persistence of vision is an optical illusion that lets our eyes see still image after still image, and then our brains translate those still images into movement. Why do I bring all this up? Because this ties directly back into smear frames. When you pause a movie and see a smear frame, it looks funny, because you're seeing it as a still image. But when the animation is played, your brain translates that smear frame into movement. So the smear frame is using persistence of vision on its side by tricking your brain into seeing faster movement than what's really there. It's how Looney Tunes and TV shows could produce snappy looking animation even though they usually animate at lower frames per second. This doesn't mean higher FPS movies haven't used the technique though. Two of my favorite examples of smear framed used in 24 frames per second movies are Aladdin and Cats Don't Dance. Aladdin is actually kind of notorious for its smear frames. There's a goldmine of these everywhere throughout the movie, but the amazing thing is that you'd probably be pretty hard pressed to actually see any of these without watching the movie on a slower speed. Disney typically used smear frames very cautiously before then, and that was because they were working on movies where smear frames wouldn't fit well with the art direction of the film. But when Aladdin hit the scene, it was first and foremost a comedy, and with that came art direction that called for the animation to be snappier, and as we already established, smear frames help make that possible. Aladdin still uses smear frames with a lot of thought though. Like I said, smear frames aren't obvious when watching the animation, and that's good, because while Aladdin is a comedy, it still wants the characters in conflict to feel human. It's a fine balancing act to walk, and the Disney team pulled it off fantastically. Now back to my other example, Cats Don't Dance. This is another high FPS film that uses smear frames to make its character animation snappy and fluid, but the use here is so much more broad and wild, really taking advantage of the fact that these characters are cartoon characters. Neither method is better than the other. In fact, I feel like both of these films use smear frames perfectly for their movie. Cats Don't Dance's energized animation is a love letter to the Looney Tunes style of animation with its superb sense of stylization to the characters and a beautiful golden age Hollywood aesthetic that just makes Cats Don't Dance's animation so much fun to watch. It's hard for me not to smile as I look at this stuff. It's so controlled and yet wild and bursting with character, and in this movie it's very easy to see the smear frames. This is because Cats Don't Dance isn't trying to hide them from you, and in this film, that's what makes it work. Speaking of love letters to Looney Tunes and not being ashamed to show your smear frames, let's look at a short that is really given credit for first utilizing the smear frame, The Dover Boys. The Dover Boys is a Merry Melodies animated short by the Warner Brothers studio in 1942. More importantly, it was directed by the legendary Chuck Jones, who was actually on the verge of getting fired at Warner Brothers before the debut of this short. Chuck Jones has started his career at Warner trying to recreate the more elegant styles and stories from the Walt Disney Company's Silly Symphony series, until some higher-ups supposedly yelled at Jones and told him to stop trying to copy Disney. This pressure probably mostly came from other legendary director and animator at Warner Brothers, Tex Avery, who made a name for himself as being as opposite Disney as possible. As a response to this pushback, Jones tested the boundary of animation comedy and created one of the most memorable and timeless cartoons to come out at its time. But even the Dover Boys almost sealed the deal for Chuck Jones, as executives at the studio weren't exactly thrilled with the first screening of Dover Boys. In fact, you could say that some of them hated it. Luckily, the public at large disagreed, and the Dover Boys was a huge success. Its zany cartoon style was fresh, the characters memorable, but most importantly, it was hilarious. So, the Dover Boys is actually a parody of the Rover Boys, but luckily the callbacks to that part of it are pretty small, meaning the Dover Boys can still stand on its own even 75 years after its initial release, which is something not all cartoons of the time can brag about. We start off our short with a stuffy narrator introducing us to good old PU. That is, Pimento University, of course. And what can only be assumed is the school's theme song? Anthem? Right. And we get introduced to the Dover Boys themselves.
Out and away, the most popular fellows at old PU are the three Dover Boys. Tom, the fun-loving member of the trio. Dick, a serious lad of 18 summers, plus a winter in Florida, as related in the Dover Boys in the Everglades. And Larry, the youngest of the three brothers.
So remember how I said that Chuck Jones was on the verge of getting fired for not being silly enough? Well, Chuck Jones took that criticism and ran with it. As sort of an FU to his bosses, he made this short as ridiculous as possible. The Dover Boys go get their fiancée, Dora Standpipe, and yes, all three of them are her fiancé. But who could blame them, really? Just look at this ideal woman.
Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo! Yoo-hoo!
Look at her. Beauty, grace, born with wheels for feet, probably. The standards for women even back then were outrageous, am I right? Also, Dora transcends comedy for her own generation and still manages to know how to be cool with the kids 75 years later. But Simmy, I hear some of you ask, where are those smear frames you mentioned? I'm beginning to think that this was all a ruse for you to talk about some old cartoon. Well, you wouldn't be wrong, but no, trust me, let's just watch the next bit.
Little do they know that even now, within this very tavern, Dan Backslide, the former sneak of Roquefort Hall, coward bully cad and thief, and arch enemy of the Dover Boys, squanders his misspent life.
Hark! The Dover Boys. Drat them. Double drat them. They are escorting Dora Standpipe. Dear rich Dora Standpipe, how I love her! Father's money. Confound those Dover Boys! Oh, how I hate them! I hate Tom! I hate Dick! And I hate Larry! They drive me to drink! Confound them.
Oh my goodness gracious, how I love Dan Backslide. Let's take a look at some of those smear frames again. Slower this time. Majestic. So the Dover Boys and Dora go to the park to play hide and seek, because of course, why wouldn't they? And the Dover boys hide in the saloon while Dora is counting.
Then Dora must be alone and unprotected! A runabout. I'll steal it! No one will ever know!
Bless everyone who made this short. Here's where we starting to get to smear frame heaven though, as Dan Backslide steals a car to go get Dora's standpipe. These smear frames are amazing. Dan Backslide can move across the screen in 3 frames, and all of this helps push the comedy of the scene. This short is also attributed credit for making what is called limited animation popular. Because limited animation requires less frames for the artist to draw, the budget for the animation can be less. Obviously, this comes with both pros and cons. When used effectively, limited animation knows its limits and how to sell its comedy with it. On the other hand, this also later gave rise to Hanna-Barbera and then even later, your typical adult comedy cartoon shows where characters mostly stand around talking to each other and the comedy is mostly, if not completely, derived from the writing. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, but its misuse of animation as a medium is really sad. After all, Dover Boys mostly succeeded here because of its visual comedy, not because of the writing, whereas most limited animation shows you see today work in the opposite faction. There's a lot of reasons shows have switched to becoming more writing focused than visual focused nowadays, but that's another talk for another time. It's good to see how Dover Boys at least started the trend of limited animation doing what it does best. So our short starts to wrap up as we reach the climax. There's so many good gags in these last few minutes, and yet again, more beautiful smear frames, like Dora's face stretching over the whole screen here. Or this Boy Scout who finds Dora and then runs to send a signal to another scout. And then Dora. Bless Dora.
Help! 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 Tom!
Oh, Dora dear, sweet Dora dear, keep courage up and chin held high. The stalwart sons of old P.U. are here at hand to do or die. P.U., P.U., we're all for you. Yay, boo!
Don't worry, boys. I think Dora has the situation under control. This little bit is also gold.
Unhand her, Dan Backslide. Unhand her, Dan Backslide. Unhand her, Dan Backslide.
I love how he blinks here as if he's realizing that he's talking to the wrong person. It really sells the joke by giving him just the tiniest bit of humanity to him. So the Dover boys beat up Dan Backslide and each other, and Dora gets her happy ending as she...
And now it is time to say goodbye. Goodbye.
And that's the Dover Boys, the first shitpost ever to be aired on television. In all seriousness though, this short stands as a testament to the idea that you don't have to have more frames to make a good animation, and smear frames are not a sign of laziness. You can create masterpieces of animation with limited resources, and sometimes doing things out of spite can turn out some amazing work. Chuck Jones obviously benefited from it. The Dover Boys is probably one of the most revered shorts ever made, and I think it could say a lot about how we look at animation today in films and on the internet. It's important to remember that each project is different and how you animate should reflect the tone of your project. I'm Simmy, and I'll see you all next time.